Hello, and welcome to the Lotcast. This is part 2 of our talk about silent films. I'm joined by my pals, Iggy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Elaina.
Hello.
Hello. And Geoff.
Howdy.
Howdy, Geoff. My name is Daniel, and if you haven't already listened, please listen to our part 1 episode, which goes into the silent era in a lot more of a broader historical context than we're going to do today. Today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to be talking about our favorite silents in quite a bit of detail. This episode will be dedicated to each of our top fives because it's really fun and easy content to make, and everyone will eat it up. I mean, everyone loves it, I think.
Agreed.
So, yeah. It should be a good opportunity to give some recs to many different people, from people like who are just getting into the era, and even some deeper cuts for others who are more versed with the genre. So we're going to get right into it. Just a little bit of housekeeping on like what qualifies for these lists. All of our picks, of course, must be silent films, but we're restricting our picks to the silent era in particular. So no Brockage, no Koyaanisqatsi, and sadly, most of all, we're not going to be putting on everyone's favorite Best Picture winner, The Artist. We do have we've allowed some shorts, but basically, I think all of us went the feature route, with the exception of one featurette, which as someone might call it, but that's basically it.
That's cute. I like that.
I want to go around the room before we start and just ask about how did you make your list, and are there any similarities between your picks, any like themes or filmmaking devices, things like that you want to talk about? How about you, Geoff?
For me, I'm a huge history fan, so a lot of the movies that I like are usually something to do with like history fiction or nonfiction films. So a lot of my picks are definitely rooted in some form of history of some sort or some kind of epic tale, something like that. So a lot of my picks are definitely related to that.
Gotcha. Who doesn't like history? I think we all have some amount of history, and I mean, silent film is history in its own way. But yeah, I think
Definitely.
films that were about these larger historical events make for great silent films, in particular. How about you, Iggy? What was anything that united your list together?
I'll admit I was a little lazy in compiling my list. What I did was basically use RogiBot, a special bot developed in our server, The Lot, to simply pull up a list of my highest rated silent films. From there, it was easy to assemble a list of 5 favorites, and I didn't really see a specific through line per se, but I definitely tried picking for a wide variety of the films that were made in that era, and a list that was maybe more personal than your average canonical film greats that everyone always talks about.
Mm. Iggy using the power of technology to make his list. Very nice. How about you, Elena?
Um, I I think that I kind of went with the films that impact. I think there are two things. The films that impacted me the most emotionally. I think I went for some films that were personal favorites for the way that I responded to them. Um, and some of those are like really, really acclaimed films that are like very beloved. And I think I have another pick that might be something that like I just personally responded to very strongly, but I also know that I'm very big on like silent era spectacle when there's kind of like a plot to back it up. I find myself disappointed by a lot of silent era spectacle, but I think when those sort of like big budget um silent era productions are done really, really well, I think that those often become my personal favorites. So it's a combination of like emotional responses and spectacle. But I also did decide to impose a one per director rule, although I don't think my list is, I didn't really think about making it too varied by country. So I do have 5 different directors.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I was going to bring up that I actually did. Maybe I don't know if it was fully consciously, but I did have 5 films from 5 different countries, and across several different continents as well. I guess 3 or 4. I think at least content-wise, what binds some of my films together, I think all but one, they all really pushed the boundaries visually, and they created some really just visually stunning films. And they managed to create a good balance between their epic scope and the intimacy of the characters, which I think, yeah, as you pointed out, is something that I think the very best silence they get right. So perfect. I guess why don't we start off? So we would start with Elena's number 5 film, but that happens to be on someone else's list a bit higher up. So let's go to Geoff's number 5 film.
Right, so my 5th film is The Dying Swan from 1917, directed by Iggy. And this film is all about a ballerina and her doing the swan dance. That's, I think, probably the most prolific dance that your average person probably knows about to some degree. It's a pretty classic tale about a crazed artist and the lengths people will go to be famous, and all these very deep themes about finding your inner self through your art and the torture. But what I love so much about The Dying Swan is that by 1917, this is a Russian film, so that kind of aristocratic high art form is kind of where the movies were at the moment, where it's really meant for the higher class. So watching something like this, where it shows the elites failing and crumbling and ruining everything, is pretty interesting. And then also, something I like about Bauer's filmmaking is he's so just like forward thinking compared to a lot of his peers. By 1917, the things that he does with his camera in particular are quite striking, where it's a lot of long takes that track their characters kind of waltzing through scenes. So like when you watch Gisela, who's the main ballerina, do the Dying Swan dance, you get a pretty static shot of her just doing almost the entire dance sequence, which is pretty incredible as well. It's definitely one of the best performances of the Dying Swan as well. So that's a real treat just to watch that in itself. But what I like is that I kind of set the standard too for what a ballet film could mean, because there's so many nowadays, and it's kind of hard. They kind of follow that typical line of ballerina becomes an intense artist and it ends up in a tragic way. And that story of the Dying Swan is like the perfect example of that. And this film definitely is kind of one of the first to do that. So it really kind of is a great baseline to figure out where all these other ballet films are pulling from. Bauer's other film I was going to pick, so this one was going to be After Death, but that one is a lot more dreamlike and kind of fantasy in some ways. And The Dying Swan is so matter of fact. In particular, it's just showing these horrible events going on, and they're just trying to do their best and be a swan through the whole thing. So it's a lot harsher, I feel like, than a lot of his other films, where they're a little more floaty and poetic in nature. Not that I don't think The Dying Swan is a poetic movie, but it's a little more in your face with how real the pain and suffering is.
Yep, I think it's quite a nice early cinema gem. This director Bauer was he made films in this part of history that wasn't really well known. In fact, I think he was pretty much neglected until many years after his death, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And only kind of more recently was he reevaluated as one of the the great pre-Soviet masters of film. I do like both After Death and Dying Swan quite a lot. I do think After Death has a lot more to offer visually, with the kind of ghostly vibes it has. and an amazing dream sequence in particular. The Dying Swan is a lot more of this kind of eerie and morose story, still a bit enigmatic, and something that I've still thought about, like what exactly does it mean? Because I don't think it fully answers the questions it raises. So it's quite interesting. I'd recommend both films in particular.
Yes.
Yep, same here.
I've seen both as well. I think that the thing that strikes me most about Bauer's work is, well, first of all, that like pre-Soviet films are not really often thought about. I think that people think about the origins of Soviet cinema happening with like montage. So it's really great to like see um yeah, like films that came before the Soviet Union and like think about how kind of different they are from how we perceive or came to perceive Soviet silent films. Um, but as things are very technically advanced, especially for their era, I think, like Geoff mentioned, those long takes, they're like the camera work is just absolutely insane. I think that's like the best part of his work. It's After Death is like quite over the top. They're like as films are very kind of over the top, I think, but I think that it's somewhat balanced by like the like very high skill of their creation. And yeah, especially like those dream sequences use a lot of techniques that really like help in creating that vibe around it. So they're really great, kind of like not often talked about, but two really good like 1910s films.
Hmm.
I've only seen the Dying Swan between the two of them, but I'd definitely be interested in checking out After Death, especially if you guys say it's more fantastical and like it pushes the visuals a bit more.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
definitely very eerie.
Yes. Yes, very
Yeah.
creepy movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yeah, the other remarkable thing, which I'm really happy we get to talk about 1910s cinema in our list. It often goes neglected to like the later 20s silent films, but I guess just to compare like something like this to even what Griffith was doing at the time, like The Birth of a Nation was mostly these kind of static tableau shots,
Mhm.
and Bauer was actually moving the camera with tracking shots, which was pretty
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
There's like
Not
a
to
really
not to
insane
say
like
Griffith wasn't doing anything important, but
yeah.
it's just
There's a really insane
crazy.
tracking shot like long taken After Death that I remember we watched it on stream and it was a
Yeah. That's when
pretty
they go
amazing
into
moment,
society.
especially if you've seen some other films from that same time and you're really paying attention to Bauer's work. It's really mind-blowing. Um just how good the camera work is because there's really like there's not a lot of spectacle to them. But there's a lot of like very good subtle technique.
Definitely. That's kind of the best part of him, for me at least, is just how open he feels like he can be with his camera.
Yep, definitely. I think it's a good time to move on to, well, we would go to Iggy's number 5, but that's also going to be saved because we're talking about that later. So we'll go to my number 5, and this is The Big Parade from 1925, directed by King Vidor. Um, this is a war film of, I guess, two halves, but it's about this rich boy, this idle rich boy who joins the U.S. Army, and he gets sent to France to fight in World War One. And along the way, he meets a French girl, and it's really, uh, the plot itself is something that maybe a lot of people can already kind of piece together. In the first half, it's really about it's a love story. These two characters who don't speak the same language falling in love, and then the second half is this kind of loss of innocence where that develops through the first half. Um, so I really think this juxtaposition is done like really beautifully. This kind of joy and naivety to the kind of horrors of war, which it's a kind of structure that has been done almost to death since then. But I think there's really almost no film that's done it better than one of the original ones. Um, I think this is the one film on my list that I would call not extravagant visually, although it has some nice moments. But it's really more about the characters and about the war itself. And so I really like the kind of, I guess, uh, simpler style, you could say, but I think it services the film well. I would highly recommend watching this, especially with the Carl Davis score, which I've mentioned in the first part of our podcast. It's really, really magnificent. I know that some of us have caught up to this recently. So, what are some of your thoughts?
I'm very excited to talk about this one, and I would have put it on my list if I had seen it before I made my list. I think I saw it last week, maybe. Um, it's really it's very good. um, and I think the first half of it feels very frivolous, but like Daniel pointed out, there's this really striking juxtaposition between the two halves, and I think that I think we responded slightly differently to it, but the second half I just thought was like an absolute masterpiece, just in how it depicts the war. Um, and there is some like spectacle to it. There are some explosions and other um, kind of things that feel um, somewhat extravagant about its filmmaking. But I think that what really polishes off that second half to me is like how much like care and attention is put into kind of like more subtle um I guess like some subtle aspects that match with that kind of spectacle, just in like the way that the like soldiers march forward and the way that like people collapse on the ground and like all these other things are done. It's just so like calculated and measured in a way that's just really like striking and haunting, and there's absolutely like nothing messy about it at all. And so even though that like first half I thought was a bit frivolous, I think it's needed to like contextualize that second half. Um and that second half really just kind of like pulled the whole thing together for me, and I don't think it would have been as impactful if I didn't have that very like naive beginning to it. Um, and the score is like very, very important to make sure you have a good score with it, because um, the score really like heightened the tension for me in the whole thing. It was a really fantastic experience. I definitely recommend. Um, and yeah, it's one of those that I think really matches its filmmaking technique and just how precise it is, with like a good story and structure. There's really no part of it that I felt faltered, which is um, sometimes that you come across things like that more rarely than you would like to. Things that feel very technically good and also like very good storytelling. So I think this one really has both.
Yeah, what I like so much about the Big Parade is that it's like not afraid to be like this intense war film and then also super melodramatic. Like the first part
Yeah.
is like just melodrama out the wazoo, and then second part comes in and it kicks your ass hard. Like
Yeah,
that scene where they're going through the woods,
it's really
right?
amazing.
That is like one of the most haunting war movie scenes I've ever
Yeah.
seen. It's incredible, and it just right compared to the first part, it's like this is a different movie now, right? But no, it's not. So it's just kind of like an emotional whiplash, but I love that.
Yeah. And I think that that scene, like the way that they march in like a very precise rhythm, I'm fairly certain like it was
Mhm.
done with like a metronome to make sure it was like really on the beat, which like you can't hear, but you can kind of hear in the score, I guess, reflected of like this very. That's why I think the score is so important to like really emphasize like the measured counts of this
Definitely.
like march like into death basically. um but it's there's a lot of attention like paid to, I guess, like the rhythm of the film in the second half. Yeah, it's just very good.
Yeah, it's definitely very effective as a story. I think the biggest mark you could make against it is that it's fairly predictable. Like, you see that first half, and, given how light and cute it is, once the battle gets going, it'll be like this brutal wake up call to the characters that shows them the real extent of the horror of the war that they're taking part in. The story is pretty effective, though, as it is, despite how unsurprising the course of events are. And it's a real testament to the character work and the strong performances that a lot of the first half is successful in endearing you to the characters. And, the predictability becomes less of a problem once you realize that this movie is nearly 100 years old and it barely comes like a decade removed from the war itself. It kind of has to be a little straightforward and go that route so it can show to the everyday person how many soldiers went through stuff like this and how harshly they got hit with reality when they finally got into battle.
Well, for me, like the production design is really where the movie hits the most, I would say for me. Like it's fairly static when it comes to how it was shot, but the production is incredible. There's
Mhm.
thousands of extras and hundreds of cars and people, and it's so
Explosions.
The titular big parade that they do near the beginning.
right. Exactly, it's just
Yeah.
so grand and like it's the same kind of level as Griffith, but I felt way more emotionally attached to the characters than a lot of Griffith's work that's like that in scope.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the one thing, maybe the plot is predictable because it has been done a lot of times, but I think there are moments that really set it apart from what this could have been. So like like a specific scene in the second half, for instance, where after he wounds an enemy soldier, he lights up a cigarette for the dude. And there's this moment where it's like, he's his friend, but he's also, still dislikes him, and it's this, I don't know. There's this wonderful sort of combination of this kind of realism and melodrama, and I think what this film does, like, I think the film even doesn't fully end on a classic Hollywood happy ending. It has a real darkness to it that I really love in particular. So
No, agreed.
it's I think it's really great.
Yeah, there's definitely a little like strangeness to the ending. I do think also that the characters are they're not like the most fully fleshed characters that I've seen in a silent film, but they have like personalities and motivations, I feel. I sometimes I feel like characters maybe get neglected in some of these, and they're people that are somewhat like you're able to connect with because they kind of feel like distinct personalities within the film as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know I spent some of my time talking about it just now, just ragging on it for being predictable, but just to make myself clear, I did really enjoy this movie overall. I gave
Thank
it
you.
a 4.5, which makes it one of my highest rated silents, actually. I kind of added it to my preparation binge for this podcast a little late, but I'm glad I did in the end because I have a soft spot for these kind of episodic, more character focused type of stories in film. And the entire first half of this is just peeking into these soldiers' day to day experiences. They're supposed to be at like boot camp, but they're just like having shenanigans, they're having a good time. This guy, he meets a girl and he falls in love, and you're really right there with them, and it just makes the dive into battle of the second half all the more like personal. Like it makes you feel like you're one of the soldiers, I
Yeah, you
think.
almost forget they're even going to war at times.
Right.
Like
Yeah,
Totally.
the
they're
scene.
having too much fun.
Yeah, I love the scene in particular where he's trying to, he and the girl, they're chewing gum, and
Mhm.
she doesn't know the concept of gum at all, so she actually
Yes,
swallows it. It's really funny stuff.
that's a cute scene.
Yeah. um, yeah. So number 5 on my list. So let's move on to, well, we would move on to Elena's number 4, but again, she picked another on someone else's list.
Sorry.
Actually, both of those films are on my list, so I should be the one who's saying sorry. But you'll get a chance to introduce one eventually. So let's go to
Okay.
Geoff's number 4.
Right, so my number 4 is The General, directed by Buster Keaton and Clyde Bruckman from 1926. So this movie is just like, I love it so much. It makes me laugh pretty much consistently, and I just love how dedicated the movie is to its sense of place and history, as I was talking about earlier. The General is I would say, one of the most accurate depictions of like the 1860s Civil War era from the silent film era, definitely. Like they have actual costumes from the time period. Uh, Keaton took trains and completely changed them to look like how they would back then, and all his clothes, all the gear, everything about the film is extremely historically accurate, which is kind of odd because The General is a comedy film. So it's not like that was needed, but he did it anyway. And I really love that he goes to that extreme detail. And The General itself is, I think, one of the few times where Buster Keaton is making a good story. Honestly, a lot of his movies, his stories are just like, here's a gag, and then here's some more story, and then here's another gag. The General is one of the few times where comedy and drama are one and the same. So the comedy doesn't drive the plot, and the gags don't fit the story. Like, just to have a laugh moment, they all make sense within the plot that, oh, he's doing this because he's a dummy. So, okay, it's fine. And I definitely appreciate that maturity of storytelling in The General, unlike a lot of his other films. So the whole story is basically about a guy who falls in love with the girl and tries to get her, but gets caught up in the Civil War. And that's a pretty brief description of the story, but there's not necessarily a whole lot more going on at the same time. But it's about his journey, is what's so fun about The General. Something I think that everyone at least knows is the famous picture of him sitting up in the front of the train with the giant wood log, hitting stuff off the train tracks so the train can continue. That's all like real, and he could have easily died at any second doing that. And there's a lot of jokes and silly stunts in this movie where he could have died at any second, including all the performers, and they just do it anyway because it looks great in camera and it's funny. And again, right, that his dedication to the bit, to the joke, is just so awesome. And it's definitely, I think, at his peak here in The General, because he's given, I think the film cost like $200,000 or something back then, which is quite a lot for the time period. And he kind of, I think the big famous scene of The General is he crashes a real train into a bridge and it blows up, and it just it's funny, but it's the most insane stunt like ever, because it's all on camera. They had like 6 cameras pointing at this thing, and they only had one take to get it because you can't blow up a train and a bridge multiple times back then, so you just have to do it right once. Like, they shut down the entire town where they were shooting nearby in Oregon, and everyone from town came by to watch this train get blown up. It was a whole huge event. And you can still go to Oregon and see the train that they blew up. It's still there in the woods. You can just go see it.
Oh wow!
No one decided to clean that up, but it's still there.
They should not. They should leave it like that.
No, it's a great historical little thing.
It's a part of the nature now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's a great blending of comedy and drama, but it's really all about that dedication to his form. Like, I think Buster Keaton is capable of having good stories, but he's more about having that fun, excessive physical joke, and he really takes it to the peak here with The General.
Yeah, I haven't seen this since I was, kind of early cinephile in full. I did rewatch some scenes for this, and the one in particular was the one where he was at the front of the train with the wooden log. And actually, like, I remember this film, like, I remember liking it all right, but yeah. I don't remember being like actually nervous or like my heart skipping a beat at any point. But I was actually really nervous this time around rewatching the scene. He was trying to pull this log out, and he actually does the thing where he like struggles once right as the train's about to hit him, and he finally gets it out right in time, and he somehow times it without looking at the train.
Yeah, he could have just died right there. It's just insane.
Yeah, or get a really unpleasant injury to his butt. But yeah, I was also gonna, I guess you already kind of answered this, but I remember you picked Chaplin over Keaton when we did our little poll last time. And so I'm guessing even if you discount the non-silent works of Chaplin, you'd still pick Chaplin over Keaton, or is that closer?
I mean, the problem is Chaplin made a lot of great movies with sound. So I like Keaton in Small Doses and The General. So that's kind of my line for him. Chaplin, I just his stories are way more interesting to me. But I appreciate
Gotcha.
Keaton's dedication to the craft.
All right.
Another fun all the trains in the film that they used, Keaton turned them all to be steam engines, even though they weren't, and they had to use real fire to make them all move. So when they were filming with some of the trains, they caused forest fires because all the sparks from the wood that was powering the train kept going all over and started forest fires in all the areas that they were filming in. So they had to stop the movie every time they caused one and pay the state a fee. And they got an insane amount of dollars spent just on causing forest fires for this movie. So stupid.
That's pretty amazing. All right. Unless there's anything else to add, I think we can move on to Iggy's number 4. Hello?
Sorry, give me 1 second. My dog is trying to bark at the door.
Cutting another Iggy moment. We should leave one. We should leave one Iggy moment in.
Okay, I think I've got her controlled now.
Nice.
Let me see. Okay, so mine.
Perfect timing.
No, we should leave this in.
Oh my god. Okay. So my number 4, I picked. Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't get over the dog.
So for my number 4, I picked F.W. Murnau's Faust. It's another kind of contrast to the last episode where I said I decided to check out Nosferatu, one of the earliest silent films that I watched because it was close to turning 100 years old. I was wondering to see if it would hold up as a horror movie. Faust is kind of similar in that sense because I also wanted to watch a horror movie, and sadly it kind of disappointed as a scary movie, but I think it actually really impressed me otherwise because visually it's just kind of an insane movie. I think you could flip to any scene in it and there's some kind of invention going on, whether it's the special effects, the framing, the costumes and the sets. Everything just kind of blends together into a perfect cohesive vision, and I think it's one of the best versions of this classic Faustian story that we've gotten so many times over in film.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Yeah. I think I would even go as far as to say the first half of Faust is, I mean, if I could just cut that out, it might be my favorite silent film, or it'd be way, way, way up there. I do think the second half lets it down a little bit, but I think there was no one better at making these visually stunning films than F.W. Murnau in particular. I wish I actually didn't put one of his films on my list. Oops.
It's
but, not. There'll be one more that we'll talk about that I even love, I think, more than this. But this I think might have some of the flashiest visuals of any silent film in particular. There's so much going on this first half. There's disasters and fire and Faust the devil, and it's really quite extravagant and amazing.
Some people might view this as a more shallow way to look at movie watching, just go for the visuals. But as you guys know, I'm a big fan of animation, so using visuals to tell the story is something very up my alley, maybe more so than the average viewer. And going back to something like The Dying Swan, not to say it's straight up bad visually, but to me personally, it didn't stand out immediately among the other more striking films that I've seen from that decade. And that's why I wasn't as big on it as you guys. But something like Faust, it's just
Mm-hmm.
I'm flipping through the movie right now on YouTube, and it's just framed. It's literally every frame is kind of a painting, which is super impressive for
It is.
something that early in 1926. So yeah, some might see it as appealing more to flashy storytelling over substantial, subtle visual storytelling, but I more or less just see it as like using every tool in your toolbox to fulfill the potential of the fantastical nature of your story and really transport people to a place they couldn't even imagine in their wildest dreams.
What I love about Faust is Emil Jannings as Mephisto.
Yes.
He is
Oh
so
yeah,
good in that role. Definitely one of his best.
I didn't even mention the performances. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're great too.
Yeah, he's a delight. He's so I guess he's definitely evil, but it's in a very, mischievous sort of way
Hmm.
where it's he's it's like it's almost hard to take him fully seriously,
Right. He
but
seems to be having fun the whole time,
he's having
basically.
fun the whole time, and it's wonderful to watch.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
he has fun. We have fun.
That visually, that movie is quite incredible. It's definitely because he's also, I think Murnau was on set for literally like in a studio set for that whole time, so he's allowed to be quite visually insane as he is in that movie because there's so much intense lighting work being done. Uh, the production design in particular is one of his most, I guess, expressionist
Mm.
of his career is definitely in Faust. Like he just goes full on crazy angles and everything, and it's kind of incredible.
Yeah, I know I've seen Faust, um, but it's one of those that I've kind of forgotten about. I do remember that like all of these like visual aspects of it were like very good, but I think that like my final impression of it being like that second half where it just really like drags on. I don't really remember it a ton. I'm a I'm a pretty big fan of Nosferatu, so if I were to pick one of the two, I'm more into Nosferatu, but Faust is like pretty good too if you're like looking for a visual spectacle and don't really care about so much the plot in the second half, because I remember being really into it in that first half and then kind of losing a little bit of my interest. But it's still pretty good. It's still pretty good. It's hard, like I said, it's
Yes.
hard to find things that like really check every box. People have different priorities.
Yep. Yeah, no, I can't really disagree. I do think, yeah, that second half is a bit of a weakness. I just think the visual heights, for
Hmm.
me, unfairly or not, they do weigh more in my mind than losing interest a bit in the second half. Although the second half, I would say, even though I call it weaker, it's still fine. It's just maybe a little too long. It's
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I haven't seen it in like 2 years maybe, but I didn't remember thinking the second half was that much worse than the first half.
Yeah, I think I went into it already knowing that people say that the second half is not as good. And I I do think that I was very entranced by that first half and then like let down and like my final opinion being a little let down. So, yeah.
yeah. All right. Guess we can move on, and I think I am up next with my number 4, which was also Elena's number 5. And this is the film called Jacques, directed by Abel Gance in 1919. And this is another war film and the last one on my list, I promise. It is a 14-reeler, a long one. And I guess if I had to describe it in a bit of a different way from The Big Parade, if The Big Parade showcased the kind of the gritty horrors of war, Jacques, I think, is a lot more poetic. It takes more of a lyrical approach. Um, there is, I guess, to talk about the plot of the film, uh, I guess it's a melodramatic love triangle kind of set across this backdrop of a war. Um, and I believe it is World War One also. Um, what stands out, though, is a lot of the formalist touches that Gantz puts in this film. Uh, there is a lot of use of double exposure in particular that just adds this very poetic edge to the film. It was Gantz was particularly inspired by D.W. Griffith in particular, and it does kind of wear its influences a bit on its sleeve. If you can compare a little bit between like Birth of a Nation and this film, there are similarities like plot wise, racism aside. But I do think Gantz, what makes this even more impactful to me is how much it is a powerful anti-war film at its core. And I think Gantz, when he made the film, you can tell he had a lot of anger. I think he was, as the title kind of suggests, he was putting blame on people, and I think it's not just the people who sent his country and his friends into war. It's kind of everyone. It's kind of the people sitting by who didn't don't really care about this, who didn't care enough, or people that profited from the war itself. And it's really just, I think he makes it such that war is not just something that affects people on the battlefield. It's really something that should concern everyone. And yeah, it's just, and I guess one last point before I pass the baton. It contains this genre fusion element towards the end, which I don't want to spoil or anything, but it's something that is unlike any other silent film I've seen, where it doesn't even really make logical sense what happens, but it really, again, adds to this poeticism of the film overall that I really just has stuck with me, and this is why it's on my list.
Interesting.
I'll chime in with some of my thoughts because it was on my list as well. I had it as my number 5, I believe. And I think one of the things that's very unique about this film is that, like you already mentioned, that it's a World War I film, but it came, in the scheme of the silent era, quite a bit before something like The Big Parade. And this was actually filmed basically during World War I, which gives it a very unique perspective because The Big Parade was done, at a point where you were far enough away from the war that people were okay with talking about it again, but you were close enough to the war that the people who experienced it firsthand were still around to talk about that. But J'accuse is really like concurrent with the war, and it's like very much like living those experiences as it's sort of being filmed. And a lot of the extras in the film, I believe, were soldiers in the war who many of whom died very shortly after the filming, which gives it like a very real and very haunting edge. And so because it's kind of like it's very ambitious. It's a very, very ambitious film. I mean, like we're talking about the same person who did like 5-hour Napoleon movie. Like, of course, that's very over the top in what it's trying to do, and it's not always flawless in its plot. But the moments that that hit like really hit, and I saw one shot from this before I watched it, and like that shot was enough to sell me on committing like the 2.5 hours or whatever to sit down and watch it. I just found it that just beautiful and like poetic and haunting. So it's really kind of like in a unique position historically. Not completely flawless all the way through with its storytelling, but um, it's for its ambition. It's really like an amazing um, thing to watch, and it's very like emotionally impactful when you think about like how many real stories are contained within its fictional story that it tells. Um, so it's really amazing from that production standpoint.
Yeah, there's that scene in I think part 3 where
Yeah.
that's definitely one of the more impactful moments of the silent era for me. It's incredible how
Yeah.
scary and intense that scene is.
Yeah.
It's funny that both you and Daniel mentioned poetry a lot when describing the film because I had a similar experience. I was watching it earlier today and I unfortunately couldn't finish because I got a pretty bad headache and had to stop like halfway through. But during the early scenes, I was thinking to myself, wow, this is really well made. It's kind of like visual poetry in a sense. And then the movie kind of responded to me by going into the main character. You know, he's a poet. And we don't see the text of the poem that he's written, but we instead go into this like abstract visual representation
Yeah.
of what the poem is or what it feels like to read it. And it's just really gorgeous. And I thought to myself, wow, this is literally visual poetry.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited to check out the second half of the film. But that's just a scene that stood out to me and just a funny little experience I had while watching it.
Yeah, it has some really fantastic moments. Even if it's a bit inconsistent, it's really, I mean, I find myself able to forgive some of those just because of like the sheer ambition and the like
Hmm.
very emotional response.
Yep. I agree. All right. Let's move on to Elena's number 3, the first film she
Okay.
gets introduced.
The first one I get to introduce. Yeah, so this one is is this no, this isn't the only. Okay, I won't spoil the rest of the list. But for my number 3, I picked The Great White Silence, which is a documentary um about the British expedition to the South Pole that happened in, I guess the expedition was in
1910 to
1910 to
1913.
1913, but the
Hmm.
film came out about 10 years later. Um, and it was kind of like filmed in the preparations for that expedition. There's like filmmaker went with them to Antarctica um, and filmed a lot of these beautiful, like with the intention of kind of filming the landscape and filming their preparation. But as if you have any familiarity with the story, the British expedition was sort of competing with the Norwegian expedition to reach the South Pole first. And it was very anomalous and very cold um, summer. And the British expedition made a few very um, fatal mistakes in the way that they chose to approach um, their journey to the South Pole, and like unfortunately, they did not survive that, and they didn't make it to the South Pole first. The Norwegian team made it there first, and because it was such a cold year, they did not make it out in time. And so the film, it starts with this very like beautiful shots of Antarctica and the the wildlife there and the way that they were preparing and like the things that they were doing for fun. And it's very kind of like charming in the first half, although they did give the cat a racist name, which is not cool. um, a lot of the reviews on Letterboxd are about that, but it was the 20s and they were
Yeah.
racist, which is not
Yeah.
great. But
Yeah, what can you do?
very like fun things in that first part, and then because things didn't go according to plan, it takes like a very rapid and drastic shift towards kind of documenting um, that expedition, and kind of becomes like an homage to the people who were on it. And like it does like acquire a bit of like a British like explorer self-importance kind of thing, but I found it like a very emotional story because I became kind of very invested in it, and it was a story I'd heard about beforehand, and it's really like quite tragic. And I had a very emotional response to it, and I think that it's also just very cool to like see how their process of like preparing and all these other things. And I know that some people, certain people in the lot didn't like the frequent intertitles, and the intertitles kind of have like a humorous edge to them, and I think that gives like a personality to the narrator, even though sometimes like it could maybe be like too cutesy. um I just like that the narrator um felt like a human, and I felt a connection with like his own pain telling that story. So it's one that I really quite enjoy. um, and it's maybe kind of like uh, one that's probably like not as widely acclaimed as some of the other ones on my list, but I know that it is still kind of like a popular one. So
Yeah. What I really like about that movie is it makes me want to go on an adventure. Like the whole process that they go through, and even if they don't make it, it's okay. But like, just it was like, oh, I want to do that so bad. I mean, it looks like
Yeah.
absolute hell, but I want to go on an adventure and be a cool
Yeah.
explorer. Like that's awesome, and that's really fun to like have that experience with the film. And I think the reason that it's not really more well known is it's been hard to see until pretty recently. Like I think they did a new remaster only in 2020, so it's definitely going to get, I think, a reevaluation now that it's a little more available to watch.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there are these documentaries of, I mean, it makes sense, but there's these documentaries of these explorations that obviously everyday person would never go on. But it's kind of this form of escapism. Like, so we have this, we have Nanook of the North, and we have the Epic of Everest, which I think are kind of the
Mm-hmm.
three big ones as far as the silent era are concerned. But yeah, I do think this. I haven't seen Epic of Everest, but I do prefer this to Nanook in particular. I think aside from the intertitles, which I do think, to be fair, it is a documentary, and I think they do. Obviously, you need a way to inform people about what the expedition is, and some context and stuff. But maybe a little bit too much for this film in particular. But I do think it did a really good job of conveying the sense of what life was like in this expedition. How did these people live in particular? And so you really felt like you were a part of this group that was actually going up. Something that I think Nanook maybe lacked, and also there's this, if you do read about it, there is a bit of artificiality to that movie that
Mm-hmm.
I don't like in particular,
Yeah,
and
same.
that does kind of damage, and creates more stereotypes of the people that it's looking at. But anyways, yeah, about the Great White Silence, I'd highly recommend it for the kind of uniqueness of the footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I meant to check this one out during my prep for this episode, but I just didn't have time. Sorry, Elena. I think everything you guys are saying, though, sounds pretty up my alley about imparting the sense of adventure on the viewer and the camaraderie that comes with being the only humans in such a desolate place. It sounds pretty good. I'll be sure to check it out sometime.
One of the other things I want to say is like, with regards to there's a lot of very like beautiful footage of, I guess, like untouched landscape in it. But I think a lot of its appeal is also finding this like humanity and like emotional resonance in such a desolate and hostile environment. That really kind of, the setting really heightened the emotional impact for me as well, I think. It's just very human in a very like inhuman place.
Agreed. Well, I think that's a good way to transition to Jeff's number 3 pick, which I consider a pretty humanist film in particular. So, Geoff,
Yes.
what is it?
So I chose Diary of a Lost Girl from 1929, directed by G.W. Pabst. I'm kind of realizing it now. My list is a lot of Germans. So thank you, Germany, for making some good movies back then. Diary of a Lost Girl is an extremely intense film in the drama department. It's pretty. It's pushing all the buttons for the time period it's released in, and forces the viewer to have quite a visceral reaction to this poor girl's experience. It's about this young girl who gets raped by one of her father's coworkers. So she's pregnant. She has to get an abortion, so she goes into prostitution. And the film is very matter of fact about all of these things. And this is 1929. So all the things they're talking about are extremely hot issues that they are currently talking about. Prostitution, in particular, at the time, was a really big deal. I think in 1927 in Germany, they got rid of all the prostitution houses. So this film's almost kind of like a response to that in some ways. Um, but it's just the drama in this is so palpable, and it's in your face, and it's brutal every step of the way. Um, it's like turning that expected lifestyle of a young woman at the time and turning it on its head. It's like, well, if the perfect world for this woman is corrupt and dangerous, go into prostitution, maybe that's better, right? And it's a way to see prostitution as a way for this woman to feel any kind of sort of freedom, um, even though it's not, though, right? She's forced into doing a lot of things she doesn't want to do, but she has to because that's all that's left for her. It's quite bleak, and it's really also Louise Brooks who plays the lead. She gives a really emotional performance in this. She's famous for like that fun bob haircut that was really big for a little bit there. She's the owner of that, and she rocks it. um, but she is astounding to watch in this movie. She gives quite the performance and sells every second of it. Um, it's Pabst isn't like his other German contemporaries who are doing more expressionist stuff. He's very much a realist in his realism cinema. He's all about showing things as up close and dirty and factual as he can. And I appreciate the maturity of the brutal stuff that they show in this movie. And it's really all about Louise Brooks for me. Her performance is just so incredible in this.
I would even go as far as to say that the performance Louise Brooks gives in that movie is probably my favorite silent performance out of all the films.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
She's so like expressive without like playing it up, and you can just get inside her mind so easily, and all of her body language is top notch and precise. I guess that's the way to put it.
Yeah, it's definitely a complete performance by her. Like there's no questioning on who she is.
Yeah, I was gonna also comment on her performance in this film, and she's in Pandora's Box as well. Um, and I mean, like the performance is very good, but if you've ever, I don't know if everyone listening to this has seen like or knows what Louise Brooks like her look that she was famous for is really like because she has a very like striking image, especially it's like that haircut, and I think that like her very like dramatic image really like matches the film very well as um like
Definitely.
yeah like her I don't know, just like her overall like appearance really makes the film what it is, and like how just like heightened the drama of it is and how like tragic it is. um just her like very dynamic image and kind of this like very 1920s like flapper icon image that's like this like modern woman and not very like traditional, um really kind of goes with that as well. Like if anyone owns that image, she's definitely the one that like owns that 1920s image.
Definitely.
So
Yeah, I do actually prefer this to Pandora's Box. I kind of see these two films as kind of opposites in some ways, where Pandora's Box is, ostensibly kind of about a woman who causes, havoc to everyone she encounters and everywhere she goes. Although I think the film questions that, it's not as straightforward as it might seem. But I think Diary of a Lost Girl is more of a film about this kind of redemption story of this woman, in this world of very dark things, and
Yeah.
evil. But I wanted to just say a little bit about the context, I suppose, because we didn't really talk about uh, the only German films I think we mentioned before were expressionist ones, but there was this kind of counter movement to expressionism that emerged, I guess around this time, late 20s or so, where I guess it was called the New Objectivity. Basically, it because of German society being like dislocated after World War One, and the middle class being impoverished, and there was inflation going on. So it was really just a horrible time all around. And so films kind of turned away from the morbid, psychological expressionist style and trying to depict more of the grim social realist type of films, also called street films. So, and G.W. Past was one of the, I guess, masters of this genre.
Yeah, definitely. He was kind of at the forefront for that.
Yeah. And I guess one other thing was this, I guess he was also known for being a pioneer in helping develop Hollywood's invisible editing. So he did a lot of good work in like cutting on action and cutting from shots of like a character's glance to what the character actually sees. And then,
Mm-hmm.
So these are
Yeah, that's a
stuff
great
that
point.
Hollywood basically borrowed and it became staples of mainstream editing.
Right, and Louise Brooks even was taken over to Hollywood, where she didn't do super well either. But it's just, it is interesting how much of the German movie scene gets taken to America pretty quickly after the silent film era.
Mm-hmm. Right. All right, let's move on to Iggy's number 3.
So for my number 3, I went with another horror movie, but this time it was actually one that affected me with its creepiness quite a bit, contrasting to Faust. I chose Dante's Inferno by
Enjoy saying those names.
Giuseppe De Ligoro.
It's
It's actually like 3 directors, and I'm not going to bother trying to pronounce them all. But yeah, the one released in 1911. Now, I think I watched this movie in the perfect way. It was about midnight. I was getting a little tired, but I knew I still wanted to watch a movie, so I pulled it up. And I was just immediately blown away by the experience that is watching it. It has some of the most like crazy out of this world imagery that I've seen in a silent film, and that's pretty notable because it's actually, having come out in 1911, it's the oldest film I've ever seen, and it's just really notable for me because the way I watched it, it had no score at all. And it was just completely and truly silent. And that just made the whole thing that much more eerie because it felt like the kind of movie someone would find in like a box in the woods and there's like no explanation for it. It's just like creepy, cursed found footage that came from another realm. That's what I love about it so much. It's kind of like unexplainable.
Mm-hmm.
Question. Is this like the oldest surviving feature though? Does anyone know that?
I don't think it is.
Okay.
I think there were, I want to say, some in the 1900s, like even as early as 1906 or 7, that are survived, but I don't know if people are interested in them for some reason.
I was just wondering because
Yeah,
it
I
feels
should
like
pull
it's
up
like
those
the
notes.
earliest film that people happen to watch. And yeah, I agree with it. Like the visuals are really kind of fantastic, especially like I mean stuff that comes out in like 1917. I'm very like blown away by like how much is able to be done visually, but you would think that something from 1911 is like fairly rudimentary, especially like being basically like a feature length. But there's still a lot of very like haunting and creepy like visual techniques that are used to like convey that like
The rivers of
I guess
souls, all that.
yeah, like mythological
Shocking.
concepts, which is like really amazing that those techniques were being used that early. And like I try to imagine like trying to like put myself in the place of watching this in 1911 and like they're maybe not have ever seen a film before, and these people like, and it's not just like things in real life as they happen but like on a screen, but like this other mystical realm that's being shown on a screen that doesn't exist in real life. Like it's not capturing the real world.
It's maybe their first experience with like fantasy.
Yeah, it's definitely like I can't imagine how like mind-blowing an experience like that would be, um with the medium of film being so new, and like delving into realms of fantasy that early. So
Yeah, I always kind of think of George Méliès with Dante's Inferno because Milios has like this version of devils and demons and stuff, and it's a little more fun to look at.
Yeah, that's fair. I kind of forgot about those.
Dante's Inferno is very serious and
Yeah.
very intense visually for the time period of what they're showing. So it's fun to see that difference of creators who are pretty close to each other and are doing very different things with the visual medium there.
Yeah, I want to just, I think, talking about the earliest silent feature, I think as far as surviving, this might be it. The one I was thinking of was The Story of the Kelly Gang, which only, I think,
Right.
17 minutes have survived from just cursory searching. So I guess that one would not count. But yeah, back to Dante's Inferno. Yeah, I do think the tableau style, kind of without a narrative thread exactly, but it's just kind of this a tour of hell, basically, which I think it does pretty well.
Mhm.
There's lots of surprisingly uncensored imagery in this
Oh,
movie.
yeah. I
Yes.
was
Like
going to
naked corpses and stuff, and yeah,
Yeah.
it gets pretty wild. So I really quite enjoyed that.
Yeah, I kind of think of there's that later Italian epic, Cabiria. I always kind of pair them together because Dante's Inferno is kind of like a staging ground, and then Cabiria goes the whole 9 yards with visual insanity and scale, and it's insane.
Interesting. Yeah, actually, I haven't paired the two too much together because I don't even register this as much like a narrative film on the same way as Cabiria is. But I'd have to give that more thought.
Yeah, I will say that Dante's Inferno is paced pretty slowly, but I don't really think that's its focus. But over a feature length, sometimes I was like, okay, I'm good. But it really is quite a sight. There's a lot of fun techniques and naked people.
Always nice.
I honestly didn't even notice the pacing. I was just like in shock, horrified the entire way through.
I looked at your review recently, Elaina, and the quote that I pulled from it was, "It is also paced like molasses and makes me want to fall asleep." So
I'm sorry. I don't remember writing that, but it is paced pretty slowly. I'm sorry, but it is very
Molasses,
cool. I'm not selling people on it very well.
that's fine.
It might be a little bit paced like molasses, but I like the idea of it being like a tour of hell rather than like a narrative arc. So I will give it that.
And that's, I guess, a decent segue for my number 3, which is the other documentary on our list. This is also Iggy's number 5. This is Man with the Movie Camera, directed in 1929 by Dziga Vertov. And this is a type of film that I guess I would best describe as a city symphony or a travelogue. It really is kind of its own genre. That it has a few other similar counterparts in the silent era. There are a few made right before this. Manhattan, I should say, in 1924. Berlin Symphony of a Great City in 1927. But those kind of all pale by comparison. If just looking at Man with the Movie Camera, I think this is just pure maximalist craziness and amazing visualization of everything that goes on in a city from the start of a day to the end. So yeah, it really uses every camera trick in the book. A lot of radical use of montage and inventive editing techniques. And it's really, honestly, I think I had to rewatch this to really fully grasp it. I think the first time I don't think I liked it too much at all. But because it moves so quickly, I was something that I was not used to at all. It might be like the most fast-paced silent film I've ever seen. It's so kinetic.
It's kind of the opposite of Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, it's every shot is so quick. It almost really just kind of approaches a subliminal quality. So yeah, it's really something that's just hard to describe. There are moments in it that I find really fascinating. The stuff, it's quite a reflexive film as well. It's a film about filmmaking, what a city would look like. There you see the camera so often in this film. So Vertov, I think, is trying to capture so much here, and I'd be curious to see what you guys think. I'm still a little bit lost at trying to explain my thoughts, but yeah, I'm sure everyone's seen this and might have some thoughts.
Yeah, it's kind of like a switchblade of camera techniques and editing tricks. It's so fun
Yeah.
to see what he's decided to do. Like he just picks on pretty like mundane things and just does something creative with it, and that's so. It's just so awesome to see him pick apart stuff like that in that way. It's like such a visceral experience, like you were saying, where silent movies are so like stoic for the most part, or a little slow right in the pace department. But this movie is just like wham, right in your face, constantly going somewhere new, and it's just wonderful to see.
It's kind of overwhelming trying to, think of everything that I want to say about it. It's kind of a perfect movie, I think. It sets out to do this one thing, capture a city, and it does it in the most like insane, enchanting way that it possibly could. And it really makes you want to like look at the world in a different way. Like it's kind of life affirming in that sense. Like it makes you want to look at your own city with like these kinds of eyes and experience the world in the same kind of exuberant way.
Yeah, and if you just think about a city, there's so much going on. Every person has a different life. There's highs and lows, and this movie was it's able to show like a funeral happening alongside the birth of a child. It's like it's able to juggle so many different things, um, and show you just really this incredible detailed portrait of a city. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, really anything unlike anything of its time and since, really. So
Definitely.
all right, well, let's move on. We're getting into the final couple of picks for all of us. So Elaina is back with her number 2 pick.
Yeah, for my number 2 pick, I went with Passion of Joan of Arc, which I know is very like I feel like an obvious pick, but I was kind of surprised. I don't think anyone else chose it. And this was really the film that got me into silent films. And I think if you've never seen a silent film before, this is where I would recommend to start. And I think what I love most about Passion of Joan of Arc is it's so frenzied and alive, and it feels like it vibrates with just like energy. Which is like really kind of insane. It's really difficult to describe in any other terms. Again, going back to like the idea that I don't think it's true that like all silent films are like stoic and still, but like I feel like it takes a really frenzied experience to really get into what silent films can do, um, and the impact that they can have. And I found it so incredibly visceral when I watched it, especially thinking about the frenzy of approaching death. I think is a very interesting contrast, and it's not really like true to what Joan of Arc would have been like in real life, but I think it's a really great way of like approaching the subject and forming a really like heavy hitting impact with the viewer. I definitely think that this is like deserved as one of the like greats of silent film and one of the accepted canonical masterpieces. Yeah, just like how alive it is, I think is really amazing.
Mm-hmm. I like how tight the movie is, like
Mm-hmm.
physically. Like when she's in the jail cell and everything, it's so close. Like the
Mm-hmm.
close-ups in particular, right? I think is what
Yeah,
the movie's best known
especially like
for.
her face and her emotions and her like tears and everything. Yeah.
It's like the classic act with your eyeballs like performance. Like it's all about her eyes and how close we get. It's so personal an experience.
Yeah, Maria Falconetti in this film is I mean, everyone has lauded her as one of the great performances, not just of silent films, of film in particular. So I really don't have anything more to add to that. But yeah, I don't honestly like this is a great movie, and I do really love it. I don't have. I think the only reason it didn't make my list is I don't think I have a lot to say about it. Um, it's a really moving experience for me. Um, both I guess I get it is quite disorienting in times too. I think Dreyer's use of the camera, it still feels a bit dizzying with the Dutch angles and kind of how relentless it is. We talked about
Mm.
the tight close-ups of her interface. But yeah, just getting these extreme angles of the jury and of it's just really just it's experience that doesn't really let go. It's so yeah, it's really moving. And yeah, I agree. And it should being one of everyone's first silent films.
It's a great segue to everything else because of, I think, the pacing in particular makes it a little easier to approach.
And I think it's also one that I would really recommend watching with a good score, or one score in particular that I forget what it's called. That's very like widely accepted as the score that's normally put to it, and
The Voices of Light.
I think yeah, and I think that you need something really explosive and really helps you like match that energy from like a audio experience as well, I guess. I don't really have a whole lot to say on it other than it's a really emotional experience that I think everyone should have, and I think it should be one of everyone's first silent films, just because if Passion of Joan of Arc doesn't like sell you, I don't know what else will. I mean, that's maybe a lie. There's plenty of other things, but I think that's really like a great selling point.
Yeah, just go watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And we would move on to Geoff's number 2, but we're actually going to save it because it shows up as someone's number 1. So let's go to Iggy's number 2.
Actually, I changed mine last second. I made mine number 2 as well as Geoff.
They're tied.
Okay, then I guess it's a perfect time to discuss it. Wow. All right, I guess, who wants to introduce it?
I think you'll do it more justice than I would, so you got this, Geoff.
Okay. So for my second pick, I chose Sunrise by F.W. Murnau. This movie, it probably would be my number 1, but we'll get into that later. But it's one of my favorite films of all time. I love this movie. It's one of the most beautiful, poetic things I've ever seen in my life. And there's just so much creativity brimming from it that I just respect it on so many different levels. The story is kind of this poem about a couple who have issues, and there's I don't want to get into the plot too much because so much of it is tied to the visual storytelling, so it's a little hard to talk about plot wise, because if I just say the plot to you, it'll sound like kind of a terrible film, if I'm being honest. So much of it is about the visual experience of it. I kind of this is like the perfect quintessential movie to me when I think about light and movement in films, because there's always some form of light creeping in on somebody from somewhere, pretty much 24/7. It's just a constant battle between what is lit and what isn't lit, and it's incredibly creative. There's this scene where they're at a dance hall, and there's a bunch of mirrors on the floor, so you can kind of see people dancing above you, and it's just one of the most gorgeous scenes I've ever seen in a movie. It's so incredible. Like this movie, I feel bad talking about it because this movie just needs to be seen to really understand where I'm coming from with this. Like, Murnau has always been like a visually creative director, right? Like Faust and Last Laugh and Nosferatu, and all those other movies. Like, he's doing things interesting visually, but on this one in particular, I feel like he hits his peak with what he's doing. There's so much, just the way scenes are composited and arranged are really interesting. It feels almost kind of like still life at times, just the way people are arranged and objects are moved around. There's this really great, I think one of my favorite movies from him also is The Last Laugh. There's this amazing dream sequence in that movie where they're like in the hallway and all this crazy shit is happening. But in Sunrise, I kind of consider the whole movie like a really mature version of that scene the whole time, because there's so much interesting play with forced perspective, long tracking shots, and some of the tracking shots in Xavier are truly quite incredible. There's a lot of stuff where he's doing tracking shots from the ceiling, so they had to create like this whole ceiling rig for the camera, which was kind of unprecedented for the time. Um, there's just so much detail in this movie, and it's so beautiful to experience. I had a very emotional experience with it when I first saw it, and it just gets better every time I see it. It's just quite an overwhelming experience for me.
I would agree with that. I think F.W. Murnau is probably one of my favorite silent directors, and I think Sunrise is probably his best marriage of like strength in the visuals, but also strength in the story department as well. He just uses it so well to tell like this dreamlike story of the two, the farmer and the woman he meets. And I remember watching it, and I was just like completely enraptured from start to finish, which up to that point a silent film had never done for me. I'm pretty sure if I go back and check my diary, it was the first silent film that I ever truly loved. And it was the one that really opened my eyes to like the ingenuity the filmmakers needed to achieve in order to get the shots they wanted and depict the imagery they wanted to showcase, and their ability to build character without necessarily needing a whole lot of dialogue.
Yeah, there's this great scene where the couple are going into the big city in the story, and the way it comes in is just this really creative use of where people are walking away and they seem small while the city gets bigger and bigger, and it's again there's like this forced perspective look, and it's just incredible to see it like happen in camera.
Yeah. I guess I mentioned this film in part one as being the very first silent I saw, and not particularly liking it the very first time I saw it. But that did change. I actually saw this again recently uh, for this podcast about a month or so ago now, and something that doesn't that rarely happens to me is I was actually crying at one moment in this film, um, which I can't remember the last time that's happened, but yeah, I guess the moment where they leave the church, and
Mm-hmm.
basically there's this earlier, uh, the film is I guess it is a symphony of sorts. It has a first movement, which is this really dark expressionist chapter, and then it has this middle movement, and then kind of an ending movement. And this is kind of at the end of the first movement, where basically they leave the church, and basically it is kind of their own marriage. They're kind of remarried again, but then they
Mm-hmm.
walk onto the street, and then they kind of walk into traffic, and then the city just suddenly changes into the countryside, and it's like time stops. It's everything doesn't matter except for these two people in this moment, and they kiss, and it's oh man, it's just so much. It's too much. Yeah,
Yes.
I guess I wanted to characterize, I guess, my kind of this change in what I thought of this film. I think what some people that might criticize this film would think about it is that I think they might, like I did, I think they might interpret it maybe too literally, because I think that first part of the movie, there's this heinous act that the husband attempts on his wife,
Mm-hmm.
um, that is, by modern standards, completely like unforgivable. And I think it's like, why would she ever go back to this guy after doing this? But I think what I didn't realize until kind of more recently is this is, I don't think, meant to be kind of a literal depiction of two people. I think it really is, as the title says, it's a song. It's kind of a fable. It's something that it's about two souls, really. And I think that's what German expressionist is really about. It's kind of like a soul in search of itself, and I think this movie is about two souls in their own reconnection. And so it's really just lyrical, and I don't know. I don't even think, I don't want to say the plot doesn't matter, but it's really meant to be just kind of something, a springboard for the actual experience of this movie.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's just it means a lot more to me now, for sure.
I'm glad to hear it. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it as like someone's first silent movie though.
Hmm.
It's just I don't know if it's necessarily approachable if you don't have a couple of things under your belt because visually, I mean it's immaculate, but it's hard to kind of I feel like get the context for why it's so incredible in that department if you haven't seen what they were doing by that time. I think 1927. So it's just quite striking.
I think maybe I should have started elsewhere, but I eventually came around. That's a good point to move on, I think, to my number two. And this might be the weirdest film on our list. Okay, so this is a film called Limite, directed by Mario Peixoto in 1931. And if you go to Letterboxd or anywhere, it's his only feature. It's really his only credit as director. So that's interesting. Um, I'll talk about that a little later. So this movie, um, we're going from Sunrise, which we'd said maybe not the best first choice for someone's first film. This is absolutely should not be someone's first film. This probably shouldn't be the first 20 films someone watches unless they really love avant-garde cinema. Um, that's probably the best way to describe this. It's really a story that never is fully made clear. It opens with three people adrift at sea, basically. I mean, we follow them in this flashback narrative as to like how they arrived at this point in their lives. It's kind of like that classic, record scratch. How did I get in this situation? Except art house version of that. And like, who are these people really? And to be honest, I don't know if the film ever really answers that in any, straightforward or any way, really. The narrative itself really gets stripped away at some point, and it really just becomes about what, to me, makes this such a great film is just its visual significance. This is a film about the beauty of the world that it is portraying. It's could be, I guess, best described as if you took Soviet montage, that style, but you just kind of rounded up that choppy editing to create something rounder. And again, I'm going to use this word, more poetic. And yeah, I think it becomes about lots of things like the boundaries and limitations of ourselves. The opening image, I should say, even before we go to the people at sea, is really striking and haunting. It's this woman. It's basically, well, you're almost looking at a photograph, really. It's a woman in darkness, superimposed with a picture of handcuffs over her. And the director was really inspired by this photograph on the cover of a French magazine that had the same type of shot, and he used it for his film. And yeah, it's really just a stunning image that kind of bookends this whole narrative and makes it kind of this cyclical type of story. It's really hard to sell someone on this movie, so that's why I'm really hesitant to recommend it. I will say it's a movie for the people that don't like intertitles at all. There are only, I believe, 3 intertitles in this whole movie, and I think one is because of a lost scene. So it's really just 2. It's really just a purely visual experience. Very floaty camera work. It's kind of obnoxiously long for some people, but it's really an experience unlike anything else. So that's why I place it this high.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else in here has seen it.
Yeah, I really wanted to watch it, but I heard about it when you first watched it, which was months and months ago, and I've been pretty intimidated by it ever since, and I keep meaning to watch it, and I've seen about like 60 silent films, and I'm still pretty intimidated. So maybe you could tell me not to be intimidated, but maybe I should be. I don't know.
Well, I think as long as you know what to expect, and as long as you
Yeah.
know, I think you're pretty well accustomed to narratives that really aren't narratives at all, or that the narrative really becomes stripped away at some point in the movie. So yeah,
Is it comparable to something like A Page of Madness?
I think it's pretty. It is along that line. I would even go as far as to say there is less explanation. I think in A Page of Madness, you can kind of write it off, the really surreal parts as being like, okay, we're in this, asylum, so there's going to be weird stuff that's happening.
Mhm.
In this movie, you're almost wondering like, what is, like, why exactly would the film be like this in some ways? So it really becomes the film taking over from the actual supposed narrative that's depicted. But yeah, that is a good comparison. I think if you're open to something like A Page of Madness, this can be up your alley. I won't say it will be.
Interesting. Have you seen the short by Buñuel, the Ancien Adlo,
Yeah, I think we've all seen it.
with the
Yeah.
eyeball?
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of get. Is it like that in some ways? That's always kind of my go-to avant-garde kind of silent
Yeah,
film.
I would not call it like, um that kind of Picasso-esque imagery. Really, I'd
Mhm.
call it maybe more like, I think I put in my review, like if Terrence Malick made a silent feature,
Oh, there you
it's
go.
with the elements of Soviet montage. But yeah, it's really just this poetic experience, and I don't even, I think if people who love Terrence Malick, of which there are many, um, I think only a subsection of those people would like this movie. Anyways, I did wanted to just follow up. I did say this was his only directing credit. I think he had one other feature he worked on, but it got lost in a fire, which is unfortunate.
Oh, that's too
But
bad.
he really didn't direct much else aside from that. So it's really just kind of this one-hit wonder kind of guy. So it's really fascinating from a historical perspective.
Yeah,
I should also
that
mention
sounds
this
interesting.
Yeah,
director.
really very interested.
Yeah, you've set it up well.
Yeah, this director is Brazilian. Yeah, and I think this film is regarded by snobby Brazilian critics as like the best film of Brazil. So take that for whatever it's worth.
There you go.
Anyways, I
I
won't.
don't usually trust those Brazilians, but I'll trust you.
uh, that's a dangerous
If
proposition.
you say it's the best Brazilian film, then
Yeah. So that was a good little rant for, I guess, however long that was. So let's move on to films other people have actually seen. So, Elaina, this is your final pick. What is your number one film?
yeah, I went with my number one as The Phantom Carriage, um, which I saw also somewhat recently. I think I saw it maybe a month and a half ago. Um, and it's by I need someone to help me with the pronunciation of the director's name because I don't want to butcher the Swedish.
I believe it's Victor Herstrom. It's like an H.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually have seen a few of his works. And this one happens to be my favorite. The other one that I really like is A Man There Was, which is very like kind of simplistic, and I know we probably use don't take a shot every time we use the word poetic, but also pretty poetic. He also did He Who Gets Slapped, which is essential clown cinema for anyone who's interested in 1920s clown cinema, which is only me.
Another famous film movement we haven't really gotten into.
That'll be the
Yeah,
next episode. Yeah.
clown
Yeah, we need to
cinema.
dedicate a whole episode.
I think I only know of He Who Gets Slapped as um silent era clown cinema, but that's not what this is about. um yeah, I went with Phantom Carriage because I think it's really it checks every box for me. I think that it has a really fantastic premise and story, and I think that it uses its effects very neatly and very well within the context of its story. And so it's kind of, I wouldn't really say it's like a horror movie. It kind of blends a few different genres of like horror and fantasy. But the premise is that uh, if you die on at like the stroke of midnight between New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, that or I guess when you die, that like death comes to you in like a carriage to like, come collect your soul or whatever. But if you die on the, stroke of midnight, you have to be like the carriage driver for death for like the whole next year. Um, and so just within like the first you know, like 10, 15 minutes maybe, um, like the protagonist of the film, he like dies on that um kind of like stroke of midnight, and his like friend comes to like collect him and explain. It kind of goes through his life, and this like the man's life who dies, and like the protagonist, um and sort of like the ups and downs, and like you know his like sins and salvations, and all kinds of things that are I won't spoil the whole plot, but I think it's really well done, and it's paced pretty well, and uses its time pretty well, and it's like I think a fairly like complex story as far as the silent era goes. And I just think also like the effects that are used to create this like ghostly looks um are just used very well. It's very like good with its technique, and there's very just like good lighting and all kinds of things that really enhance its like spooky vibe. But yeah, I really like that it's more than spooky vibes, and more than cool effects. Like it has a really great story to go with it, and I just really like this idea of like a phantom carriage that like comes to get you when you die, and um, I don't know. It's just like a very cool premise and very cool execution. I think it just yeah, it checks every box for me. It's really kind of like a quite emotional tale as well, but I don't think that it's its primary motivation. Um, and yeah, just very good. Probably my favorite film by my favorite silent director. So
I always kind of, when I think of the Phantom Carriage, I just kind of consider it like the better version of A Christmas Carol. It's kind of fits that same, where it's about a man who goes through life and sees everything that he's done and
mhm.
could be a better person. All these other fun parts, but really, it's like the movie like oozes with that like creepy, ghostly
Yeah,
atmosphere. It's
that's a good
so
way to describe
good.
it. It does kind of have that like Christmas Carol-y like plot, but the vibes are different.
Yeah, it's way more fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it even uses like triple exposure in some shots. It's really there's a
Mhm.
lot going on visually. And I like to compare this to a film that was released the same year, which is Fritz Lang's Destiny, um,
Oh yeah,
and how the
that's a good
two
Mm.
comparison.
both use double exposure to show like ghostly apparitions and death itself. So they're really both
Yeah.
stories. I think this is definitely on the spookier side. I think Destiny is a lot more of a, I guess I could even call it adventurous. There's moments of just it's I guess more fun.
And it's several stories in one. One similarity between the two that I think is kind of cool is the way that they interpret death as kind of a physical thing, because death is kind of is an abstract concept, but death is a carriage, and there's also parts in Destiny where death kind of takes on like a physical form, which I think is very cool when you're working with like a visual medium and trying to like create images of abstract concepts, which is why I think those films work pretty well. Well, at least Destiny, I think, works really well in that particular aspect. So,
Yep. All right. I think we'll move on to Jeff's number one.
All right, so my number one is a Fritz Lang movie called Die Nibelungen. Excuse my horrible German there, but it is this that story. I think is one of the most fabled tales in all of German history. It's kind of like the German Iliad in some ways. It's just this epic poem from I think the 1200s. But it's a lot of all of Germany's mythology and ancient history kind of woven together into this giant epic, and this movie just puts it to screen pitch perfect. Like it is almost exactly what I would picture in my head after reading the poem, and that's just so cool to see, and especially for a movie from 1924. The movie is split into two films, which is kind of cheating here, but you're really supposed to watch them like directly together, which does mean it's a long watch. They're both incredibly long movies, so it is quite an epic experience the whole time. But something that I really like about this movie is just a lot of very interesting, cool camera tricks being used here. Lots of superimposing, lots of mirror and spotlight tricks to get a lot of visual effects going. And there's just so much technical work in the creatures that they show. There's in the first part of the movie, there's this giant dragon that the hero faces, and it's pretty shocking how how big it is. Like it looks, it is not. I'm not gonna say it's aged well, but it is so incredible to see what they could do back then in 1924. Like that's probably the best dragon they could do for the 20s.
Yep.
It's pretty. It moves. It spits fire. Like it looks angry. It's awesome.
I would say it doesn't look like a realistic dragon,
Right.
but it's still like pretty intimidating just because of how freaking big it is still.
Yeah, exactly. And you know it's in the camera and it's
Yeah.
there, and that's such fun. And there's stuff like that throughout both films continuously, where they just push the envelope of what you could do special effects wise. But I think the big thing for me is not necessarily just the technical aspects, but just like how it continues like this mythic tradition for Germany itself. Like the story is one of the most taught and talked about myths for Germany itself, and this film is such a great like continuation of that, and it does it. I mean, like I said earlier, literally perfectly from the poem. It's pretty incredible, and the whole Wagner's opera, who did an opera on this as well, is definitely something you can tie to the film itself, which definitely helps a lot with the music and just like that operatic experience that a silent film can only give. It's pretty insane how impactful this movie was. Like I know it influenced Eisenstein and his Ivan the Terrible movies a great deal. I think the big like history thing for this movie is this is kind of like one of Hitler's favorite movies to show and watch, because it just shows like, you know, pristine blonde Aryan German being the best at everything the whole time. So it's used as a piece of propaganda definitely for Germany too in that way.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
It is unfortunate, right? But it just kind of shows like the power of myth and how movies like that can be used in a bunch of different ways. And I really respect that. I would say the first part, Siegfried, is definitely more enjoyable than the second part, which is Kriemhild's Revenge. The second part is a lot more with like Huns and their invading force, and he has to kind of get rid of them. The pacing in that one is pretty brutal, I gotta say, in particular. It's also because it's a poem, so there's like a lot of strange not things that are connected story wise. Like you kind of have to leave like a story narrative at home and just kind of enjoy this epic, like I guess kind of maybe like a picture book would almost kind of be a good way to describe this series, like these movies. No,
I was
go
gonna
ahead.
say, yeah, the framing of like many of the shots, they're very picture book esque.
Yeah, and I really that kind of aesthetic I really enjoy.
Yeah, I would even say I kind of wish it even had more adventure in some ways. I think the first half, yeah, of part one, really fun stuff. It becomes a bit, it settles down a bit into this kind of almost Shakespearean sort of drama,
hmm
where I gotta say, I think I think some of the characters didn't have their brightest moments that led to their downfall. But
Yes,
I mean, it's still remarkable visually, and I can't take that away from it. So yeah, part 2 is definitely a lot more of a war film, and so quite different from part 1, and it is quite brutal. I would agree with that.
yeah.
This one very nearly made it to my list. I really enjoyed it because it's just, I don't have much else to say except it's very entertaining. I just had a blast watching it. I'm kind of a sucker for these like fantasy epics, and like you said, the first half of it is like the epitome of that for the silent area. And Geoff mentioning like the mythic quality of it just now, it kind of brought my mind to an interesting comparison. I don't know if you guys will agree with this, but I kind of think of this as like the silent era Star Wars, and that it brings like this myth that everyone knows, or like everyone in Germany, and it kind of brings it forward to their modern time
Definitely.
and makes it palatable in like a fun way with like lots of special effects. The scope is grand.
Yeah, I'd say to agree with that because right, Siegfried follows the hero's journey fairly close. So that's definitely a parable that Star Wars is literally all about.
I will say Siegfried is quite a bit less likable than Luke Skywalker.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit less of a hero for your kid to look up to if you watch it with
Yeah,
them.
that's definitely another thing. Is like Siegfried's not a good person.
No, he's not.
Like at any point, really. Like he just is kind of a giant asshole. And he just waltzes through these adventures like, yep, I'm gonna do it because I'm Siegfried, so fuck you. It's just so fun, like his cockiness.
Yeah. All right. Guess we have a good nugget for the Star Wars fans. All 2 of them listening. So, Iggy, your new number 1. What is it?
It is a movie I've mentioned in part 1, Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. And I'm just gonna like reiterate a lot of the love that I played for it in part 1. I don't know if I would call it Chaplin's best because there's movies that I like more from him, but I would say it's like his most consistent maybe on all of the fronts that matter to him. It's like consistently funny. The story is, for a 90-minute movie, it's not like the most ambitious, but it really worked for me. I don't know. I believe the characters. I believe the emotions that it like presented, and I just think the humor in it still holds up. Like probably the most of his like purely comedy movies, well, that I've seen anyway. There's like a good variety of jokes between like just purely slapstick stuff to like more visual, surreal comedy, I guess you could say. With like the moments where his cabin partner looks at him and he appears to him as a chicken, or the entire like climax of the film. It's just this completely over the top dangling cabin on the edge of a cliff.
That's definitely the classic image I think everyone thinks of.
I don't know. It's just super entertaining, super heartfelt. It's kind of what I love about movies.
Yeah, I think the other part I remember most is when he sticks the forks in the potatoes and he does a little dance with them. I think that's what he does. But yeah, it's if I remember correctly. But yeah, that's was I think it was bread rolls actually. But anyways, yeah, it's a fun movie. I think all of Chaplin's stuff, the big ones, the City Lights, Modern Times, I place on a very similar tier. They're all just consistently funny and moving in times, and and lots of memorable moments and jokes. So I don't know if I could even really pick one. That's really my favorite. But this is as good as.
I might be biased because like I watched this the most recently, but yeah, it just like sticks out in my mind compared to City Lights as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen this one. I haven't seen the last one either, so I haven't said anything in a while. But yeah, this is one I definitely should see. I'm slacking on Chaplin, so
yes. When we reconvene for Silent episode part 3, then you can report back.
Disclaimer is that part 3 doesn't. We don't have plans for that yet.
It'll happen. This is becoming a silent podcast.
I think.
In fact, 2 of the 4 episodes we have are silent. So
I think our
mean-
third episode should be on clown cinema and Charlie Chaplin.
He's kind of an honorary
That's
clown.
only
There you go.
only like funny things and things that are like funny adjacent, maybe. I'm joking. It was a joke.
Clowns scare me, so I can't do that. I can't.
You scared of
Clowns
clowns?
are just terrifying. Yeah, I don't like
Oh my
clowns.
god. Clown episode canceled.
Maybe it'll be like therapy for Geoff.
I'll watch in the distance. Yeah, scare me with clowns.
It's okay. We'll just ambush Geoff. We'll
Yes,
start
we
recording
should.
a completely different episode and then we'll switch it 10 minutes in.
Nice. All right, I guess final pick, which is my number one, which was also Elena's number 4. And this is, of course, Metropolis, also by Fritz Lang, directed in 1927. So this film, I think everyone has at least heard of, even if they haven't seen. And everyone has definitely, once you've seen it, you'll recognize instantly tropes that have come from countless movies that have been inspired by it. Anything related to like AI or robots, I think the director has seen Metropolis and consciously or not put a little bit of that movie in their own. So yeah, this movie, I guess, best describe it as like this urban dystopia. Fritz Lang creates this vertical segmentation of the population. Basically, there's 2 levels: one for the rich and the pleasure loving at the very top, and then one at the bottom for all the slave workers who basically do all the machinery. They're the working class of this society. So, it's a premise that is quite similar to movies like The Platform more recently, or like High Rise. And they all borrowed basically from this movie as well. So, like, I guess to tie it into our Die Nibelungen discussion, it is actually quite operatic in its scope, and even its score, which is quite extraordinary as well. The world is extremely fleshed out for something so it's all fictional and sci-fi, and there's so much detail in everything from like the backdrops. So it's really just stunning visually, and I still contend it holds up really well today. You can look at some of those images of like the ships flying over the city and stuff like that, and it's honestly, I don't know how he did some of this stuff. Like, I mean, you could tell me he used, backdrops and different exposures and whatnot. And it's like, I still couldn't believe that you make something look this good. But even visuals aside, it's a film that really is unafraid to take a bold political stance on really huge and like relevant topics like the exploitation of the working class by the wealthy. So it's something that works for me on like every level. Just the plot, the political commentary, the effects, and the visuals. So I mean, it's something that I haven't seen in a long time, but it's so vivid in my mind. I really want to rewatch it. I kind of want to actually. I know Iggy, you saw this in theaters with a live musical accompaniment, and that would be my dream, like a top 5 ever like goal of mine for movie
here.
watching.
Yeah, it was definitely a very special experience. I'm glad I got to catch it that way.
Yeah, I hate you and I'm jealous, but yeah. Yeah, that's I could go on about my love for this movie, but it's I think everyone, if they haven't seen it, they've heard of it, and if they haven't seen it, just stop listening to this and watch this.
Yeah.
So
I guess it was on my list as well. So it's another one of those that checks a lot of the boxes as far as like plot and visuals. But one of the things that I think really like defines German expressionism and is really like a huge strength of German expressionism, or like German expressionism associated films, um is just like how strong the set design is. And like I think that the set design and like the world that is created in Metropolis is like completely like unparalleled. It's like it's pretty insane. But it's on such a large scale, and it's not just like one scene that's, uses all the, I don't know. It's not like one scene that like really wows you. It's like the whole thing all the way through um is just like amazing, and it's very like, I don't know if it's like Art Deco kind of style. Maybe is that what it is? I don't
Yeah, it could be
know.
a little bit.
I don't know.
It's like gothic
No, it's like it's
futurism.
definitely like gothic inspired, but it's very like futuristic, and it's very like geometric and defined. I mean, I think that was a very popular style. I don't know. Don't quote me on this. I'm probably wrong, but I mean, I think like futuristic gothic is definitely like an aspect of it, but it's also kind of like channels a lot of kind of like design trends of the era, I think. But it's very cool. It's very cool visually in a way that I don't think I'd see in a lot of other silent films. And honestly, I don't remember a whole lot of its plot. I agree with most of what Daniel said about the film. Um, and it's pretty like amazing how good a copy that we have of it now. It's pretty good. It's pretty easy to access a good restoration of it that has a lot of the recently found footage from it, because until like I guess like 10 years ago we were still missing quite a bit of it, and I think now it's about 2.5 hours in length, and they only really think that 5 minutes of its longest cut is missing, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a pretty great time to experience that one, because we can experience it in a way that other people before us um, didn't really get to experience. So yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how impactful this one movie has been on like pop culture. Like Metropolis is like the base building block for pretty much the whole genre of sci-fi and cinema. Its reach is so far, and like you can see its influence even in stuff made like today in Dune, or like Blade Runner, or even the Tron movie. Like just everything pulls from Metropolis in some ways if you're making a sci-fi movie. So it's incredible how how impactful it's been. And this was almost on my list, but I didn't want to fill the list with Fritz Lang movies because it's boring. So I had to just pick something. Because there's a bunch of his stuff I would definitely put on here. But I think Metropolis is one of the very first silent movies I'd ever seen. Cause it's definitely advertised as like one of the first ones you should see too. But I just distinctly remember watching a scene when the workers are going down to their like their little areas where they work, and their faces are like so gaunt and like haunted looking, and the light kind of comes up on their faces over time. Like that has stayed with me like ever since. Like that image is so like seared into my brain. On top of literally everything else that is that movie visually, like just
Yeah.
Yeah,
goodness.
speaking of images, there's a phrase I've wanted to use for a couple movies that we discussed, namely Sunrise, Die Nibelungen, and Faust. But I realized that we were going to talk about this movie coming up, and I withheld myself because I knew it was more true about this. I was going to say that Metropolis is kind of, for me, the king of imagery in silent film, because there's so many iconic moments, like the workers slowly hunching towards the elevators, the robot design. There's even like iconic intertitles, which is remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things about Metropolis also, I mean, people say it's one of the first silent films that you should see. And it is like quite long, but I don't think it's like a difficult well, it's hard to watch something that's that long and is a silent film if you're not really used to them, but it's not like as much of a drag as some other ones that are of a shorter length can be. But I think like people say it's one of the first that you should watch, but also for people who aren't into silent films, I think that this is probably the one of the ones that they are most familiar with because of its widespread influence. Because I think a lot of people have seen images from Metropolis or seen like a clip from it or know something about it. Whereas like even something like Passion of Joan of Arc, like I don't think the general population really knows anything about. But Metropolis has like taken on the most like iconic silent film, I would argue, maybe.
On Letterboxd, it's like the most seen silent film, I believe.
Yeah, so I would probably argue it's like the most iconic because of its influence and how, people know about it.
Yeah, just one last thing, because we talked about Star Wars earlier. Just look at C-3PO and then the robot from Metropolis and try to tell me that it wasn't inspired from Metropolis. So
Right.
yeah, just another one for all you Star Wars fans. So
Shout out to the Star Wars fans.
yeah. Yeah, I think that is a wrap on all of our picks. I think we all have a few honorable mentions. So let's just go once more around the room. Elaina, what were some that just missed?
Um, well, I think the big one that wasn't on my list was The Big Parade because I saw it too recently. I didn't want to change my list. I would also say, oh, I don't know. There's so many. I mean, A Man There Was because I didn't want director repeats. And also, I would say Nosferatu. Probably Page of Madness because I don't think we mentioned any films that. Well, we had a Brazilian film on here, but otherwise, we were all European and American films. But unfortunately, there's just not as much that survives out of Asian silent cinema. Yeah, Page of Madness is incomplete, but I think those are ones that kind of missed the cut, but are still very good.
Yeah, it is a bit unfortunate, but yeah, it just very few of them have survived, and some of the ones that have are probably in not great condition or haven't
Yeah.
been given the treatment that all the films that are on our list have luckily
Yeah.
received. So yeah.
Mhm.
All right, Geoff, what are some that missed your list?
Quite a lot. This was very hard for me to come up with because there's so many amazing movies from this era that I would like to talk about, but there's never enough time. But some of my picks that almost made it was Napoleon from Mel Gantz. That movie is quite the epic. I don't think any other movie has really gotten to how large in scale that is, and just how complete an experience it is as well. Um, there's The Last Command from Joseph von Sternberg. Love that movie. Love that movie. Emil Jannings again. I think he's like one of my favorite actors from this
He's
era,
great.
but,
Yeah.
but he's so good in that movie. He just completely commands the entire screen, and it's also just it's a cool movie. Um, the Epic of Everest, I think would definitely be one of my other picks. That's another one of those early 20s documentaries, but this one was about people who first went to Everest. Um, what's pretty incredible is all the footage is real and from the actual exhibit. Like they brought all this equipment just to record them going to it. So it's definitely the most real documentary I think I've ever seen of people failing and trying to get past that. It's also just gorgeous and terrifying, and yeah, I think it's better than the one we were talking about earlier, The Great White Silence. Not just in it's how it depicts this adventure that's really happening in front of you. Let's see what else. There's Taboo. Taboo is another Murnau picture. I think that's most of that was real close to coming on my list. That's an incredible movie. Very strange one from him in particular because it's on an island and weird island gods are talking to the characters, and everyone's kind of just flailing around trying to understand how to live. It's very strange even for him. So Yeah, and a bunch of the movies you guys talked about would definitely have been on my list, like Big Parade, definitely. Uh, Metropolis. So yeah, lots of good picks.
Nice. I'll have to check Epic of Everstout. Sounds really good.
Yeah, it's really astounding.
Right. Iggy, how about you?
Most of my honorable mentions were like movies you guys already had in your lists, and I wanted the chance to talk about a couple of my other preferred films. So yeah, my honorable mentions were Phantom Carriage, Diary of a Lost Girl, The Big Parade. But I also wanted to shout out The Adventures of Prince Achmed, which I think, as flawed as it is for being the first surviving animated feature, I think it still has a lot of heart and energy that you can still appreciate to this day. And also Sherlock Jr., which is I guess my first Buster Keaton film that I've really enjoyed. And it's a short watch, 45 minutes, but every inch of footage holds such a laugh, you know?
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Really amazing. Some of the both stunts and the that slideshow sequence in the theater.
Yeah, that's so good.
Really, really amazing. All right, and just some for my list. I have some. I guess that we mentioned The Last Laugh by F.W. Murnau, and I guess Sunrise. I should say would probably should have been on my list, but again, I think I rewatched it too late. My favorite film by Victor Herstrom is The Wind, his film that he made when he came to Hollywood. It's a it's not for everyone, but I think it's a really interesting kind of even sexual psychodrama that really goes into the power of the symbolism of the wind and what it might depict, and some really haunting, gorgeous imagery. My favorite Buster Keaton film is called Seven Chances. It's a kind of a film where he's basically he's trying to find a partner in life, a romantic partner. So it's quite funny, and yeah, a lot of wacky hijinks ensues when he struggles to do that. And yeah, Chaplin, I couldn't really pick one, but City Lights probably would be my favorite. And I guess one last one to mention, just this little short that I just find to be really captivating. It's this avant-garde Dadaist short called Ballet Mécanique, and it's really just this 16 minutes of sheer kinetic energy, lots of just abstract images of fragmented people and machines and things like that, with a really just wild score of like airplane sounds and car horns and just lots of crazy stuff. So it's a really short experimental film that I'd recommend.
Excellent. Yeah.
Right. So I guess anyone have last thoughts on the silent era as a whole? I guess we'll go in the same order. Elaina?
Oh, I'm being put on the spot. Last thoughts on the silent era. Well, I was like recently explaining to someone what I love so much about the silent era. And I think that what's so great about it is that people were just trying lots of things and seeing what stuck. It's really exciting when something is unexpected, or like, I suppose when things really exceed your expectations. And I think that silent films often kind of like blow my mind with what was possible so early. And I think that's what's really special about them. And I don't really know what else. I just I'm very tired. I'm very sorry. um, uh, no, but I really love when things really exceed my expectations. With the silent era, and I think that when silent films are really great, they're really really great and really rewarding. And so, I hope that other people can find some enjoyment in me sharing some of my favorites. So.
Yep. Great. Geoff?
I think for me, what's just so attractive about silent films is that it's such a tiny little blip of an art form, but it's so important to movies today that you can't separate it from now. And you can see it's just fun watching an art form come alive right in front of you, where you can see things you take for granted now being figured out and tested and honed. And the how much they explore with these new tools is just fascinating. So I really respect the adventurism of it all, and it's really fun to see even a sliver of it.
Yeah, agreed. Iggy.
I don't really have like conclusive thoughts. I feel like I'm still early in my silent film enjoyer era. I just hope to watch more. I was actually thinking it would be interesting to do a similar project that you do, Daniel. Your one per year series that you did. It'd be
Yeah,
cool to like go.
still
Well, you've passed
kind of
the
ongoing,
silent era
but
one now.
yeah, it got stuck.
Yeah, it'd be cool to like go year by year and
Yeah.
see it literally evolve before your eyes, like Jeff said. But yeah,
Yeah, it has been quite rewarding to see things in that way. It provides a lot of structure and context to the films you're watching. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to try, and especially because I hadn't seen any 1910s films prior to a recent, binge. So yeah, that was kind of my main motivation. But yeah, I guess just very simple last thoughts. Silent films, I guess they're it's pure cinema. It's I think the invention of sound really grounded films in a way that was a bit, uh, it's a bit sad that we lost this kind of surreal storytelling that was at its just kind of experimental uh, peak in the 1920s, especially. But yeah, directors were just doing so many different things, and I wish that it could continue longer, but alas, yeah, it was just a great cinematic language that I still am surprised with even some of the deeper cuts that I watched that like, how unique some of these films can still be. So yeah, I think that wraps it up. This another marathon episode. So I want to thank all three of you for joining me and talking about silent films once again.
Yeah, thank you. It's
Yeah,
been fun.
thank you.
thanks for
It
having me.
was, yeah, it was a great discussion, and hopefully not our last. So yes, for now, talk to you later.
Bye.
Peace.
Goodbye.